House of X, #1. Written by Jonathan Hickman, art by Pepe, Larraz. So this is the biggest comic that came out from Marvel this week. This is a pretty big deal. They've been hyping up this miniseries by Jonathan Hickman for months. They've even saying the solicit for this comic. Since the release of Uncanny X-Men #1, there have been 4 seminal moments in the history of the X-Men. Giant-sized X-Men, X-Men, Age of Apocalypse, New X-Men, and now I guess they mean this, and now this. So they have a lot of hopes in this book. So Jonathan Hickman was brought in because he's a pretty popular writer. He's had some pretty good runs. I particularly liked him on Fantastic Four. Great multi-year run. Then he did this Avengers run, which I was a little bit mixed on. But they have a lot of trust in him. And they are bringing him in to fix the X-Men. Because frankly, the X-Men comics have been bad for years. Creatively, they've just not been good. You might have an interesting book every so often, an interesting issue, but on the whole, X-Men have been flailing. They have not been good. So they're hoping they can bring Hickman in and do a complete status quo refresh for the X-Men. And he definitely did in this opening issue. Stuff is very different for the X-Men after this. Now, if you've been following X-Men recently, they've had this whole Age of X-Men event going on, and luckily they've thrown that out entirely. It doesn't really matter. So we are starting fresh in this. However, I wouldn't say it's exactly new reader friendly. This is more so for people that know their X-Men lore and are sort of jumping back in. So let's dive into the story in this issue and see what's different with the X-Men now. So we open on some weird planet, and a man and a woman hatch from these eggs. Then we see what is apparently Charles Xavier. Now he is wearing this Cerebro helmet, and we don't really see his face. Now it's kind of almost even debatable if it's him, although the comic does say this is Charles Xavier. His costume is very similar to this character called the Maker. Now, the Maker is this insane Reed Richards from this now destroyed Ultimate Universe. Now, is it the Maker? Is it Charles Xavier? It's hard to say. They're saying it's Charles, though. And this potential Charles Xavier says to these new hatched people, "To me, my X-Men." And it's weird. Who are these hatched people? Are they clones of the X-Men? My point is, everything is not as it seems. Now, Xavier has had a very, very convoluted journey in Marvel Comics over the last decade or so. He was shot in the head in this Messiah Complex storyline. He was rendered an amnesiac from that. Then he died at the hands of a Phoenix-possessed Cyclops in this Avengers vs. X-Men storyline. So he's dead then. Then the Red Skull grafted a piece of Xavier's brain onto his own, transforming the Red Skull into this character called Red Onslaught. However, that piece of brain was later destroyed. But then the X-Men discovered that Xavier's consciousness was being held prisoner on the astral plane by the Shadow King. So even though Charles was dead, his consciousness was in the astral plane. So then Charles was returned to life from the astral plane, but he was only able to do so by taking over the body of Phantom X. So now Charles is sort of back to life, but he's in this body of Phantom X. He was taken over by the Red Skull at some point, and all this crazy bizarreness. So Xavier might be a little bit messed up. And one thing interesting in this comic is that usually Xavier is sort of the guy that wants to take the peaceful kind of action, and Magneto is the one that wants to be more confrontational with the humans. But in this case, Xavier has sort of come over to the side of being confrontational with the humans a bit. So we're going to see that a little bit in this issue. So then we see the various X-Men planting these flowers in various locations. One is on Krakoa, another in Westchester, the blue area of the moon, on Mars, in the Savage Land, in Washington, in some place called the Jerusalem Habitat. These flowers appear to sprout these huge vines that covering even an entire building. Eventually, some ambassadors show up to this Jerusalem Habitat, And they say they're there because Charles Xavier delivered a telepathic message to the world saying he has an offer the world can't refuse. Now, Charles wants the island state of Krakoa to be treated as a sovereign nation. In exchange, Charles is offering a drug made from these flowers of Krakoa that we saw planted everywhere. And these flowers have the ability to produce a medicine that will extend human life 5 years, as well as being able to prevent diseases of the mind, as well as another that will make the most effective adaptive antibiotic the world has ever seen. So these are definitely things humanity would want. We also learned that these Krakoa flowers that are spread across the globe, they've created these habitats in all these other areas, each functioning as a self-sustaining environment connected to the Krakoa Island's consciousness. Another flower grows a gateway that allows transportation of mutants between these habitats. So it sort of acts as a network that the mutants can use to transport from one location to the other. And the only way for a human to travel through these gateways and become transported is if they are accompanied by a mutant. And even in that case, they have to ask Krakoa for permission. So what is Krakoa initially in the comics? Krakoa was originally a very small island in the Pacific Ocean that was located close to where some nuclear bombing tests were done. The radiation somehow turned the island's ecosystem into a hive mind entity, and now it's essentially this like alive mutant island. And now in this storyline we see its role has sort of been expanded into sort of like this overall island nation state for the X-Men with all of these sort of powers to it. So the ambassadors are led inside this Jerusalem habitat, but instead of being greeted by Charles Xavier, they are greeted by Magneto, as well as telepaths MC and Sophie. So then we jump to this place called the Grey Malkin habitat in Westchester, New York. It appears to be maybe the old Xavier mansion, and Jean Grey is there in her classic costume, and she's walking this mutant kid to this portal where these flowers of Krakoa will transport both of them to the island itself. So they've been transported, and they are now in this lush area. And the mutant kid goes and runs over to Wolverine, who's playing with him like he's like a big teddy bear. But then we see a slightly eerie looking Charles Xavier there looking at Jean. Perhaps there's nothing to this look, but it definitely seems a little bit suspicious. Elsewhere in space, we learn of something called the Orcas Protocol. It's a doomsday collective of the largest agencies in the Marvel Universe. So we're talking AIM, S.H.I.E.L.D., Strike, Sword, Alpha Flight, Hammer, Armor, and Hydra. So all these organizations. Representatives from each organization have retrofitted a space station out of the floating head of a mother mold robot, and this station serves as a watchdog program to secretly observe mutant influence in the world. And perhaps this group is a way to sort of counter the mutants if needed. So we're sort of being introduced to a opponent for the mutants in the future. Now we're following these ambassadors some more. They are getting their tour of the mutant Krakoa network. We learn that the doorways in this network each have like a particular writing on them, and it's explained that it is just this made-up language that only mutants can read, and they were given the telepathic ability to read it imprinted in their minds. So humans can't read this, only mutants can, and Charles Xavier was behind creating this. So they continue the tour, and they go from place to place through these gateways, and the ambassadors eventually become a little bit concerned about the military aspects of all of this teleportation stuff, because if you can move an army vast distances without being seen, people are going to have a problem with that. And Magneto argues back, where you see an instrument of war, I see an unassailable refuge. That's quite a difference. There's never been a mutant war ambassador. We've never conquered a people, stolen their land, or made slaves of the vanquished. That's our real advantage. So he's basically saying the mutants have never treated humans as bad as humans have treated themselves. The ambassadors want to go to the actual Krakoa. They're going to all these other places in the Krakoa network, but they want to go to the actual main island. And it's explained that they won't be going there. Magneto explains further, you have heard Charles Xavier's offer, Mutants are the evolutionary inheritors of this world, all of it, but instead of claiming it, we are giving it to you and keeping only a small portion of it for ourselves. The island you see is ours and ours alone. Man is not welcome there. Jumping over to Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth, they are all hacking this computer in this damage control facility. Now, what is a damage control facility? Apparently, it's some sort of corporation that operates as an archival unit for government-contested metahuman machinery and technology. A lot of it is advanced schematics by Reed Richards and Tony Stark. So they're hacking this facility, they get some info, and then they leave. And when Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth get outside of the facility, all of a sudden the Fantastic Four are there to stop them. So Mystique and Toad run into the Krakoa gateway and they manage to teleport away, escaping. Sabretooth was trying to get away as well, but the Fantastic Four managed to stop him. And they have sort of Sabretooth captive now. But then Cyclops shows up out of the portal and he greets the Fantastic Four. He asks, so I'll take Sabretooth then off your hands? And Reed Richards is like, not liking Cyclops' tone, and Reed is like, why would we do that? We just captured Sabretooth. We're not just gonna give him over to you. And Cyclops says, you're a smart man. I know you know what amnesty means. And Reed says, Sabretooth broke a number of laws in the past hour, maybe even injured and killed some people. Are you really offering amnesty from that? And Cyclops says, it's upsetting, I know, but I'm afraid we are. New beginnings demand a wide berth. And then Reed says, and I think we have a problem with that. And Cyclops lets it go, and he says, fair enough, I can see you feel strongly about this. Why don't you keep him and we'll deal with it some other time, some other way. And then Susan Richards asks, Cyclops, these things Xavier is doing, what are all of you thinking? Basically, why are the X-Men so combative right now? And Cyclops responds, my family has spent our entire lives being hunted and hated. The world told me that I was less when I knew I was more. Did you honestly think we were going to sit around forever and just take it? I believe in what Xavier is doing. And then as Cyclops is heading out, he says, please greet your son for me and tell him when he's ready. He has a family on Krakoa waiting for him because Franklin Richards, Sue and Reed's son, is in fact a mutant. So Cyclops definitely being very combatant here with the Fantastic Four, who are supposed to be his friends. Now, jumping back over to these ambassadors on their tour. Their tour is ending. They are back at the beginning where they started. And then Magneto asks, so what have we learned? And the ambassadors think he's talking to them, but he was actually talking to the telepath mutant with him. And she explains what every person there is actually thinking. So why even talk to the ambassadors when the mind reader could just tell you what everybody's thinking? So most of the ambassadors are eager to accept the deal because they'll get something out of it. One of the ambassadors we learned was actually a Black Ops agent with a weapon, and Magneto quickly dismantles that weapon with his magnetic powers. Magneto then closes by saying, Charles Xavier has made you an offer, one full of grace and brotherly love, but also one that is written in stone. This is not a negotiation. Things will be different now, and the sooner you realize the inevitability of your situation and the inevitability of ours, the sooner you will learn to be grateful for things we are so generously giving you. And the ambassadors are saying, so you summoned us here to threaten us? And Magneto says, a promise is not a threat. I summoned you here for symbolic reasons. And right now they are in Jerusalem, the Holy Land. And Magneto says, you see, I know how you humans love your symbolism almost as much as you love your religion. And I needed you to understand. You have new gods now. Whoa. That's a good line to end off of. So that's how this first issue ends, setting up this new status quo. The series will continue for a few months, 6 issues, and then we're going to have a companion series called Powers of X as well. And that's where we end here. So I thought this opening issue was pretty good at establishing this new status quo. So you have the X-Men living in this Krakoa interconnected network. Their mutants are a little bit more combative with humanity. You got all this mystery with Charles Xavier going on. So I want to see a lot of those plot threads play out. And because the X-Men have been flailing for the last few years, some kind of status quo change was needed. So I'm glad they decided to shake things up. Now, mind you, this is not my favorite status quo. I like the more classic status quo where the X-Men are living in Westchester at the Xavier Mansion. You got the students, you got the teachers, you got some shenanigans they get into, and then they got some villains they fight, and you got the interconnected relationships going on of the various characters. That's my favorite X-Men stuff. But nevertheless, this was needed, and we're going to have to see how it plays out and spins into the various X-Men books over this next several months. And there's lots of interesting stuff here. So I'm going to give this opening issue an 8 out of 10. If you're interested in the X-Men and what they're planning on doing, this would be a good time to maybe hop in and see how it all plays out.